How can you invest in the future? How do we invest in AI? How do we invest in the explosion of demand for data? How do we manage what, to a certain extent, is a rough time of transition, energy transition, data transition, population transition as investors, and especially as institutional investors, because we have to have a longer term view?
You are listening to the AFIRE podcast, real estate, technology, cross-border investing, and the opportunities of a changing world. Let's start a conversation now.
So today on the podcast, and we're at the end of March here in 2024, I wanted to sit down with one of my favorite futurist investors, and that would be Jeff Kanne. He's the CEO of National Real Estate Advisors. They're a subsidiary of the National Electrical Benefit Fund, who has been investing for some time with an eye towards how things are changing and how to make sure that their investments are really at that intersection of change. So thank you so much, Jeff, for joining me on the AFIRE podcast.
That's my pleasure, Gunnar. Thank you for having me.
How do you think about responsibly investing as an institution into future trends?
Well, that's a big question. I think, first of all, it's incumbent upon all of us who are investors to think carefully about what the world's going to be like in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. That's always been true, but it's more true today than I think it's ever been in the history of humanity. Technology is rapidly advancing. AI, the advent of AI as a practical technological tool is going to greatly increase the rate of change.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about investing today versus, say, investing even 15 or 20 years ago, honestly, I'm very nervous. I'm very nervous about where you can place money and think it's safe. I think a few years ago, a comment like that might not have resonated very much with many real estate investors. I think today it's a different story, right? Anybody who owned office 5 years ago and had been investing in it for decades never imagined that an event would occur. I don't think imagined that an event would occur that would accelerate the rate of change in terms of occupancy of offices so much that assets would be selling for 20% of what they sold for just a few years ago.
Yeah.
That's happening in Washington, D.C., where I am. Before COVID, land was trading at some places $300 a foot. And now you can buy a whole building, a good office building for $50 a foot. And that's only been in 4 or 5 years. So that change has been caused by the technological advancements that have made working at home a reality,
Right.
A choice, not a fantasy, but a choice. And when I look ahead to the investing that we're doing, data centers is a good place to focus on that fear, I suppose, because one of the challenges that we have, one of the biggest challenges we have in the data center business today is power. It's not getting tenants, it's not getting land or connectivity. Those are challenges, but they're reasonable challenges. But getting power and then deciding whether or not you have power that's going to last in the long run, that's a real challenge. The demand for energy is growing exponentially, is going to continue to grow exponentially, and we'll use whatever we can generate. I believe that. And I think one interesting thing about life, Gunnar, is you can draw a line, energy production, and compare that to human economic development. And those two lines are perfectly correlated. When we had no energy sources to speak of, we had no economic growth at all. For most of our history, humans have had no economic growth.
Right.
Until really we started generating electricity and using oil in the mid-1900s. There's a tremendous demand for energy. It's going to just grow and grow and grow. And AI, the amount of energy used by AI chips is astonishing. It's off the charts, and it's only going to grow and grow and grow and grow. I worry about where we're going to get our energy.
Well, it seems to me then that a lot of what you're saying here is that a lot of people ask at conferences like AFIRE and elsewhere, how should we be thinking about AI going forward as investors? And it seems to me that one of the ways that we should be thinking about that is in the energy sector, is understanding the energy sector and being able to invest accordingly, where the energy is coming from, where the alternative energy is, where we're going to get supply. That seems to be part of how we should be constructing future looking investment thesis, is around energy.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think the promise of AI is limited by the amount of power that's available to power it. If we don't have power, we can't use AI.
Right.
And the more AI proliferates, the more power we're going to need. So in our data center business, we're spending a lot of time finding sites that have power or can have power brought to them in a reasonable, foreseeable time. It's going to be a struggle for years. AI, the development of AI is exponential. I think the human mind has a difficult time comprehending what exponential means.
Yes.
And it is exponential. It's self-multiplying in a way that it's hard to imagine where we're going to go. Think about robotics, for example. Robotics are made possible by AI.
Yeah.
It's conceivable that virtually all of our factories in the next 15 years will be run entirely by robots. That sounds fantastical, but I don't believe it is. I think that these kinds of technological changes that are brought on by something like AI happen only a dozen times in human history. That's how I see this.
Well, and it's even in our lifetimes when you think about what Moore's Law has done to us since the early 90s in terms of just the differences in our lives, in all our lives, and in terms of what makes sense and what doesn't. It took 10 years or so before we really felt the productivity shift. But once it got going, it really got going. And I wonder, where are we in that exponential growth curve when it comes to AI? Are we still very early in that?
Oh, we're very, very, very early, very early. In many respects, AI is just a toy right now because people are learning how to use it and make it useful, but not in all instances. People are using it, in a common setting like our investment management setting. We're using it to create videos and doing it quickly and less expensively than we did before. And it's very important to our business because we've learned most people don't like to read anymore. They would much rather watch a video. And I guess that's why we're videoing this.
Right.
So we're in the very infancy of artificial intelligence. I know everybody I know and every business I know are doing exactly what we're doing at our firm, which is to form a committee, prioritize where we're going to use AI, not if we're going to use AI, but where we're going to use AI and how we're going to develop AI to do the things we want to do. There are going to be so many things that can be done with AI that are going to make our lives better, but there's going to be a lot of dislocation too. And, for us, from an investment perspective, we got into the data center business because I'm a big believer in owning the railroad, not the products that are on it. And AI is a product on the railroad. They need us, data center operators. They can't function without us.
Right.
I'm convinced there'll be many big wins in the AI space, but there are going to be just as many losers.
Yep.
As long as they pay the rent, we're okay with that.
So it's no surprise that most institutional investors on their wish list, even if they haven't touched data centers yet, is to invest in data centers. They're seeing the same exponential growth in demand. They're seeing, certainly the success that operators like yourself have had developing data centers. But the question is how to get in. And it's not easy and it's not for everyone. It's tough. How should investors be thinking about their data center strategy? How do they get in?
Getting into the data center space is not easy for a variety of reasons. Usually there's always the option of investing in a real estate asset class through a public company. And there used to be a fair number of public data center companies. When we first got into the space over 15 years ago, most of the substantial data center owners and operators were public companies. We were one of the largest privately held data center operations platforms. But all of a sudden, because of the way REIT rules work and the amount of development that you can do in a REIT is limited, and because Wall Street analysts don't like to see a REIT that has a lot of development, most of the publicly listed data center companies went private again. So they had been private, they went public, they went private again. Today, Digital Realty is the biggest data center company in the world publicly. You can invest in them and you can invest maybe in Equinix. But when you get beyond that, you really can't get into this space via the public markets. And I think that's unique to virtually every other real estate or infrastructure asset class. So then you're left with, how do I find my way into a private investment? And there aren't that many private platforms that you can invest in. So then you can decide, well, maybe I'll just try to own parts of individual assets. And that's what many investors have done.
Mm-hmm.
Many investors have bought 80% of an individual asset. Maybe it's a long-term lease to one of the big hyperscalers like Amazon or Apple or someone, or maybe it's got enterprise users in it, so you have 4 or 5 tenants. That's one way to invest in data centers. I've always thought that was not a good way to invest in data centers. You need operational excellence, you need leasing excellence, you need a platform in order to be really secure in owning a data center. To own just parts of a data center, to me, seem very, very risky.
Mm-hmm.
But those are the only ways you can get in. Now, the private data center companies are all structured differently. Not all of them want investors. Brookfield got into data centers in a big way, and so did Blackstone recently. To the extent they need money, they're going to bring it through their funds. You're not going to be able to invest in those companies outside of investing in their funds. So it's not so easy to get into this space.
When people do invest in data centers, and one of my concerns is it seems to be a different kind of business. It's an operating business as much as it is a land business. Where do you think mistakes are most likely to be made? Given you have a lot of demand, which makes up for a lot of, you can make a lot of stupid mistakes if the demand seems unlimited. But where do you think people need to watch? Where are the risks?
Well, I think, a good way to approach any investment is to analyze what are the barriers to entry. It might be possible to make a good investment in some asset class that has very low barriers to entry, but the risk of losing capital in that kind of a situation are high. We've always tried to avoid investing in any asset class that had low barriers to entry. Data centers have very, very high barriers to entry. One is capital. You need a lot of capital.
Mm-hmm.
These facilities are very expensive. So you need to look at your capital capability. If you're thinking about investing in data centers, can you do it alone? Who are you going to do it with? Are they well capitalized? Can they survive? So that's a huge barrier to entry. Energy. We talked about energy. Energy is another huge barrier to entry. Doesn't matter how nice your building is or how much connectivity you have or how much capital you have. If you don't have energy, you don't have anything in the data center business.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you do have energy, if you get a service letter from a utility, typically once you've got it, you've got it forever. So people who have that asset energy have something really valuable. But that's a very high barrier to entry today, more than it ever has been. But today it's a huge barrier to entry. Another barrier to entry, of course, is connectivity. Are you connected? That's probably the least difficult of all the barriers to entry. If you have power, you have tenants, you can get carriers to come to your facility unless it's really in the middle of nowhere. But the last and maybe the biggest barrier to entry, and the thing that can get you in trouble in this investment is the reputation of the operator. You're not a technologist if you're in the data center business. What you really are, you're at the intersection of technology and real estate. You as a wholesale provider, meaning a provider who's not just providing an empty building that someone fills up, which is another way to approach the space, but I don't really see that as data center investing myself. If you don't have an absolutely perfect reputation for operations, you are not going to get the marquee tenants. And data center demand is not driven by people looking for the cheapest alternative. They don't want to pay more than they have to. But no chief technology officer wants to call up his CEO and tell him, hey, we just had a major power outage and half of our customers are furious at us because this data center went down. Mm-hmm. This happens from time to time. I can tell you, and our platform has seen the benefits of that, because occasionally people show up at our door knowing our reputation and want to sign a lease with us because they just had a huge power outage that they're suffering from because their clients are really angry at them, depending on what service they're providing.
Right.
So that's another barrier to entry, which really limits the number of platforms that are available for people to invest in, because you can't just go out and, open up Gunnar's data center. I'm cheapest in town. Microsoft's going to want to know, give me a record. But once you can get a Microsoft or an Apple or an Amazon to come into your facility, then you've got a stamp of those people know what they're doing. We trust them, and other people will trust them as well. It gives you a halo effect, if you will.
It makes sense. And it goes without saying, this is more than just having a warehouse with a bunch of computers in it. There's a lot more to it.
There's a lot more to it, but it's also not technologically forbidding. In many respects, you're just souping up in a huge way HVAC systems, the accuracy of those systems, and the power distribution networks and the backup to those power distribution networks. Those are all things we do, generally speaking, in any large commercial building. It's just more sophisticated. It's more power. It's more HVAC, more checks and balances to make sure that there's always continuous operations.
And much more reliability and, backup and backup of backup seems to be required than your typical office building, even though it's the similar system that you're using.
That's right. We're doing the same things, continuous power, but it's just, it's souped up. There's more to it, but it's not, we're not designing software. For some reason, one of our tenants' computers goes berserk. That's their problem. It's not our problem.
But if the HVAC goes down, that is definitely it's everyone's problem at that point.
Yeah. More than even just goes down. If your humidity is off by a certain number of degrees and your temperature is off by a certain number of degrees, you may well be paying fines to your tenants. So monitoring those two items, for example, are very important. But it's not rocket science. It's you just need to be careful and diligent and maintain your equipment and not try to cut corners, and have processes that really make sense and work and are monitored, and you can do it. But it's more accurate than running an office building, right?
Right.
It's not rocket science.
Well, and it seems to me to be more infrastructure science. How do you create a high level of reliability for something that needs to be always on and always work and be safe and useful that way? Given that it's infrastructure and that you're talking about energy infrastructure and delivery of energy and reliability in order to make a data center work, in order to make us able to do AI, how do you feel about the ongoing impact, or what do you see as the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the infrastructure investments that the U.S. government is starting to make? I mean, we haven't really seen the effect of that completely yet. What do you anticipate over the next couple of years?
Well, we're seeing some of the effects of that in the form of construction labor force in particular. And as you know, Gunnar, I'm very close to the electrical industry. There is a huge shortage of electricians. One of the biggest problems that we have on our new jobs is having people from other jobs come over to steal our electricians by offering them 50%, 100% more than we're paying them. So in Ohio, for example, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of all kinds of construction workers working on chip plants already, in Arizona as well, Austin, Texas as well, and not necessarily all funded by grants and subsidies from the U.S. government. And it's having a huge impact on labor availability. So in the long run, it's drawing more power. Manufacturing chips takes a lot of power. Putting batteries together, we have all these big battery plants around the country. They take a lot of power in addition to the men and women who build them in the first place. So it's just more demand. More demand, just like the demand from electric cars. It's just more and more and more. And we don't have an energy infrastructure that is capable of supporting all that right now, which is why we have a shortage. I think it's interesting. There's a great book. Well, for some of us, I guess nerds, there's a book called The Grid, which is a history of the U.S. Energy grid. Very interesting book. And one of the interesting things about it is until about 1970, energy was a growth industry. There was always a new power plant going up, always new transmission lines going up. Just the psychology of the industry is we're growing because industry's growing, demand is growing, we're growing. And then about 1970, beginning with the deindustrialization of the country, all of a sudden that growth in the energy infrastructure just stopped. And really a certain stasis occurred, and there was really just maintenance of what we had, no real plans or thoughts about we need to grow this energy infrastructure until really the late 80s and 90s when global warming started to come on the scene, and then most recently being driven by data centers and data and AI. The beginnings of that all started in the 80s and the 90s, but now it's just really, the demand is just starting to manifest itself across our entire economy and our culture. And AI is going to make that problem 10 times worse in 10 years because of the amount of power it uses.
Something that we have not experienced in our working lifetimes then, which is an energy as growth industry environment, that it has been rather, to your point, even in the 80s and 90s, on a relative basis, it's been kind of static compared to what was happening in the post-war period. So that's interesting.
I think that's one of the reasons people are finally saying, in addition to climate change, people are thinking about nuclear again.
Yeah.
For many, many years, nuclear fission was just off the table for energy generation. And over maybe the last 10 years, some of these new small modular reactor companies that are the first ones being built by a Bill Gates funded operation out in Wyoming, we're seeing technology coming to the fore now that is, one, becoming more acceptable, and two, we're actually seeing new developments in it because some people were smart enough to see this is going to happen. It has to happen. So we're beginning to see the genesis, I think, of a whole new way of thinking about power generation and capital going into it, which it hasn't for years and years and years.
That's fascinating. I mean, I've long thought that demand commands at the end of the day. So if you have the demand, we figure out a way to get supply. And it sounds like what you're saying is that we're in an environment where growth projections for the next 10 years are very difficult to trust, not because it'll all go down, which is, I think, the most people assume, oh, we're going to have a recession any moment now, but because the growth is hard to calibrate in this kind of exponential environment, that we may very well see a growth economically because of energy, because of data, because of all these things that you've just described, that could far outstrip anything we've experienced in our working lifetimes.
I believe that's the case. I believe it's absolutely the case. And the biggest challenge we're going to have as a society is to moderate, regulate, and make fair all the changes that are going to occur. Many people are going to lose their jobs. Mm-hmm. Many people are going to lose their jobs who don't have the critical thinking skills or the ability to change that it's going to require to get a new job. We could reach the point very soon, 10 or 15 years, where most of the population doesn't need to work, but need to work in the sense of economically need to work. But mentally, of course, we all need to work. At least
right.
That's my view of the world.
Yeah.
And this could happen pretty quickly, much more quickly than I think people are prepared for. It's fantastic for most of us. For other people, a lot of other people, it's very frightful.
And that transit, like all transitions, it's painful, it's difficult, and it's perhaps impossible to avoid. This is coming, whether we like it or not. So let's figure out a better way to do it if we can.
There are a lot of people, Gunnar, who just can't. They can't take change. And some people are resistant to even small changes, but the changes that have occurred have already occurred over the last 20 years and are accelerating now. It's going to make things very challenging for our politicians, for our political system, to be able to regulate, as it has in the past, the kinds of conflicts that are going to arise. In the end, I'm all positive about all this. I think it's going to be a rough patch, but in the end, we're going to be a better world because of it. It's going to be a fairer world, a more just world. But it's going to be some rocky moments there. But it's being made possible by technologies like AI and what otherwise takes place in a data center. The data centers today are the nerve center of the world.
Well, it's interesting to me. I came across recently something that Jane Jacobs wrote about. She felt that Karl Marx got it wrong, that it's not a conflict between labor and capital, nor is it a conflict really between left and right. It's a conflict between change and stasis. that whether it's social or economic, that the real struggle and people taking up arms is not because it's capital versus labor, it's change versus non-change, which we're certainly seeing it in dramatic ways around the world in terms of resistance to change that, as you said, has already happened. We're just trying to adjust to it. We are already, it seems, in that rough patch. It could get worse, it could get better, but we seem to already be in a rough patch of sorts. And the question is, are we going to be able to, will the agents of change prevail, and will we like that change as we go forward?
Oh, I think we will. I think we will. And we're already seeing, the beauty of America is the disaggregation of power and the ability for various kinds of political constituencies to experiment. That's really what makes us great: flexibility and smallness as well as largeness. And I'm starting to see around the country, guaranteed income programs going into place. Mm-hmm. Most of them are experimental, but they're going into place, and almost universally they work. If you give poor people money and let them decide how they're going to spend it, they make their lives better, and they spend it wisely on necessities almost entirely. Small amounts get. If you can imagine a world where we get rid of all our wasteful government programs and just write people checks out of all the surplus wealth that's going to come from AI that we already have in the world, it's just not really very well distributed. It could be a fantastic world. Your waiters and waitresses and service people are all going to be a lot happier when they make more money.
And when they can afford to have a place to live that's not that far from where they work and play and live out their lives. I do think it's interesting that the ideas of universal basic income, it wasn't that long ago that it really seemed fringe. Maybe it's not quite mainstream yet as an idea, but you're seeing more and more people picking it up as a potential and reasonable and rational solution to a very real challenge that we have already.
Yeah, it's been picking up steam for quite a while. And I think it appeals to a conservative sense of efficiency.
Right.
Let's not create programs that have tremendous amounts of friction, where we employ a lot of people who really don't do that much and who are making decisions for people instead of letting them make decisions for themselves.
Right.
That system doesn't trust the recipient of the money. A system where you're giving people direct transfers trusts that person who's getting it and eliminates the waste that goes with the programs.
And respect tends to beget respect. So, to a certain extent, saying you're all valuable, this is part of your right as part of this society, and we're all going to enjoy the benefits of that together. I think it just makes logical, rational, and even, let's put morals aside, although it makes some level of moral sense as well, to be thinking about how to make something like that work, which I think is fascinating.
You never sell anything based on that, Gunnar.
That's true.
You got to go with the efficiency.
You got to go with efficiency, right? No, I mean, I've got my capitalist hat on. I think that makes total sense. No, this has been fascinating, Jeff, and we could probably talk endlessly about this, but we'll probably need to wrap it up here. But again, we've been speaking with Jeff Kanne, who's the CEO of National Real Estate Advisors and one of my favorite futurist investors. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us on the AFIRE podcast.
Thank you, Gunnar. Glad to be here.
You've been listening to the AFIRE podcast. Remember to subscribe on your favorite podcast subscription service, such as Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitchers, and others. AFIRE is not engaged in providing tax, accounting, or legal advice. No content in this podcast is to be construed as a recommendation to buy or sell any asset. Some information included has been obtained from third-party sources considered to be reliable, though AFIRE is not responsible for guaranteeing the accuracy of third-party information. The opinions expressed are those of its respective contributors and sources, and do not necessarily reflect those of AFIRE.